Okay, so welcome everybody to this Rethink session by STEER, Embedding Equity into Decision Making. I am Liliana Pereira, Director and Equity and Inclusion Practice Lead at STEER. I have worked on transport infrastructure in cities for 23 years, while most of this time working with transit and sustainable mobility. I've been during the last 7 years or so working intensively to incorporate equity and inclusion in projects. Being a Colombian woman working in the United States, I acknowledge my race, gender, mother language, and I also acknowledge that I haven't experienced several burdens. And I believe that this recognition is very important, and I invite all attendees today to think about this too. And let me start with a big thank you to our panelists who have high responsibility and demanding jobs and will spend the next hour and a half with us. And thank you to the more than 300 registered attendees from more than 10 countries around the world that are with us today. And thank you to the STEER staff who have worked very, very hard to make this conversation a reality. You're all very, very welcome. So our webinar today is part of the Rethink Rooms series, a series of global forums, debates, and events that are oriented to challenging thinking across cities, infrastructure, and transport, and push the boundaries of what we know is true or what the things that we have done in the past. Drawing on experience from leaders from around the globe, these sessions provide spaces of conversation and interaction reflecting the local and international footprint of STEER. Just last week, we had a Women in Charge session with a women-only panel of senior experts informing the development of the UK's EV charging infrastructure. And the recordings of all our events are available on our website. So we are here because of people. And this may be evident, but at times we forget. People who live in conditions of disadvantage that determine the course of life. People who have experienced harms. And people who demand from us to do better. So for us, in the context of today's conversation, equity means to consider those peoples and think how to plan, design, and develop projects that acknowledge, understand, and address their needs. And we are here to talk about decisions that consider people, in particular those in need. Notably, in the last few years, there has been a shift to understand people's differences, needs, and how several conditions determine access and mobility. And also the shift is now demanding us to recognize the unavoidable relation between transport, health, and well-being. We are also reckoning that certain projects, even those aimed to benefiting large groups of population, have replicated current and historical inequities, displacement, and increased cost of access, to name a few. Also, we see an increasing recognition that while society needs to make progress, transport can't wait and can play a role, not only reducing harms, but in articulating progress too. So our speakers today are going to touch in all of these aspects. A recent survey conducted by the US Department of Transport noted the challenges reported by state and metropolitan authorities incorporating equity and inclusion, those being mainly policies and leadership direction, differing goals and definitions, laws and regulations, authority or scope, technical skills, funding or staffing. And even with executive orders in the United States and policies oriented to reducing inequalities at the federal, state, and city levels in relation to transport, only 31% of state departments of transport report that they already ensure distribution of benefits to underserved communities. Our speakers today will also cover these points from their areas of action. In STEER, we have identified that to make progress, we need nuanced, community-driven, creative, pragmatic, and context-sensitive solutions. And for this reason, we established a few years ago our equity and inclusion practice, embedded also in our partner firms, most notably in Ford Economy. We advise in the infrastructure, cities, transport, and economic development sectors, and we look to integrate equity and inclusion as part of our work. And we operate with a network of leaders and practitioners across STIR's network of offices, and this approach is what makes this webinar possible. You see and have seen the international set of speakers that we have today. In the last 5 years, we have developed more than 50 projects that have equity and inclusion at the core across the globe. And you can find more information about this in our website. With this context in mind, I'm glad to introduce our panelists today. So we have today with us a group of very committed leaders, and I can attest that, who are moving the needle. Karen Lucas is Professor of Human Geography and Director of Research in the Department of Geography, and leads the Transport and Mobilities Research Team at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Karen. Thanks for being with us today. Karen is a world-leading expert on transport and social justice in the global North and South. She is Director of the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities, which is a global network to promote transport justice in global South cities. Then we have Sadie Graham. Hi, Sadie. Thanks for being with us today. Sadie is the Link 21 Program Director at the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, or better known as BART. And Link 21 is a transformational infrastructure program that will deliver that will better connect Northern California's passenger rail network for generations to come. She will talk about Link 21 in her intervention. Sadie holds a bachelor's degree in biology and environmental studies and has a master on landscape architecture and city and regional planning and urban design. Sadie has led the Link 21 program to consider equity as a core foundational objective. We have George Darido. Hello, George. Thanks for being with us today. George is the lead urban transport specialist for the World Bank. George is based in Washington, D.C., and is co-leader of the World Bank's Inclusive Urban Mobility and Accessibility Global Knowledge Group. He has worked for more than 20 years on sustainable urban transport projects, policies, and technical assistance in more than 25 countries. He holds a master's in transportation systems, a master's in economics, and a bachelor's in civil engineering. And last but absolutely not least, Diana Rodriguez Franco. Diana, thank you for being with us today. Diana is the Secretary of Women's Affairs of Bogota. Diana has a PhD in sociology with a master's degree in sociology and is a lawyer and economist. Thank you so much for being with us again. So about today's practicalities, we will hear from our panelists setting the scene for our conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will move to the Q&A session. There will be an opportunity to ask questions online. Actually, that's the idea of this webinar. It's not just presentations. The idea is that after these setting the scene presentations, we have a very live discussion. The panelists will have the opportunity to address your questions, and we will close the session for final reflections. The session is planned to last about 1 hour and 15 or 20 minutes. The recording will be available on our website via YouTube and closed caption and closed caption with language translation options can be selected after the webinar. You can see on the slide how to ask these questions, and all the panelists will receive them from me during the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's start with the presentations. Next slide, please. So first we will start with Karen, who I have introduced to you. When we were doing one of our first projects in transport and poverty for the National Planning Department of Colombia, and we were reading all the desktop research, many of the references were coming from Karen, you and your groups. And I strongly believe that to achieve outcomes, we must build on the progress and understanding built in the academic environment. And for that reason, we want you to set the scene for us today, talking about your latest research and reflections on transport poverty. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Liliana. So what I decided I would do today is just give you a bit of a range of an indication of all the different things that we're doing within academia, but also working with policymakers to recognise the issues of transport equity, going from very early concepts of definitions and indicators, which is this project that we're doing with the European Union Department for Employment, and they're very much wanting us to set up a common set of indicators that can be applied across all 37 member states to measure transport poverty. They already measure energy poverty, and they want to start thinking about transport poverty, especially thinking not only about cost but also availability, accessibility, and acceptability. But moving further on from this, for a very, very long time, we've been mapping transport related social exclusion, so in another way, transport inequity across the UK. And this particular piece of work is being undertaken by colleagues at Transport for the North, which is one of our regional transport authorities. And they are championing on transport related social exclusion and how to reduce it as one of the key pillars of their strategy. This is just a mapping exercise showing where income, poverty and deprivation and transport, lack of transport facilities is intersecting to mean that there's a very high risk population there of social exclusion, and we're doing further pilot work in some of these areas. The third thing that we're doing is undertaking what's not the same as community impact assessment in the States, but it's a sort of combination of the social and distributional impact assessment together with an equality impact assessment, thinking also about non-motorized user impacts and also health impacts, and bringing that together at a community level to assess the impacts of large infrastructure projects. This particular one, the Lower Thames Crossing project, being a large road project. We're also doing this with rail projects, and we're also doing it with infrastructure projects that have already been built to evaluate post hoc the impacts. So from appraisal to evaluation. And in order to do this project, we've been working with our colleagues in National Highways to develop a new approach to social impact assessment, which includes not only metrics, desk-based metrics, but also more qualitative research. And so this is a research project to try and come up with an integrated impact assessment for the local communities that live alongside road projects, to see how those projects are affecting the local community now and in the future. It's just a real rapid taster because I don't have a huge amount of time. We've been doing this for a really long time. We've been doing this since the early 2000s in the UK and doing research on transport equity. And I think that one of the big messages is that it never goes away. It's always there. It happens everywhere and it's often hidden. Transport inequality, transport poverty manifests itself in different ways in different places and for different people. So these 4 A's of available, affordable, accessible and acceptable as a way to try and see whether people are actually able to take advantage of the transport system that's there and where the gaps are. This needs to be an ongoing analysis that happens at every level of decision making within transport and land use. The people that are most affected by transport poverty, transport inequities are already socially disadvantaged, almost always. So transport poverty makes their daily lives much worse and sometimes absolutely unbearable, which is why we link it to this idea of social exclusion, which basically means that people can't participate in the things that the rest of us take for granted, like getting to work and going to school and being able to visit hospital. And then the other thing is that it happens at a very local level. So it's really important to undertake community level social impact assessment of all the large projects that happen, because quite often those are the things that are exacerbating the problem. Big projects going in, and I've seen this happen all over the world with bus rapid transit, with rail interventions, often make life worse for people who are transport disadvantaged. But also the big thing is that we really need to think about how to rebalance the existing distribution of transport resources, because what we do is very much favour the transport advantaged in almost every bit of funding and almost every bit of policy making, and we always overlook the underlying needs of excluded people and places, partly because those needs are often more micro and often not infrastructure led. So they require subsidies and soft measures, which are difficult to get funded and very difficult to address. So that's me finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And if I thought that this presentation was going to be food for thought, definitely it leaves us with a lot to discuss in our Q&A session and to get deeper. Thank you so much. Sadie, Graham will be next. I've introduced Sadie and her role, but a few words that I want to use introducing Sadie. When we started working on the Link 21 project, where Steer is part of the project management team with HNTV, I remembered very vividly two things. It struck me, the recognition and bold statements, and Karen has mentioned this, about the harms generated by past projects in California. It was my first time seeing such bold statements and the basis for actions and plans derived from that. And in one of the documents that we exchanged with Sadie, you asked us to reflect on the term mitigation and consider avoidance first and foremost. And those are just two examples of your commitment, Sadie, and of the program. And over to you to tell us more about how equity is embedded in Link 21 or your reflections.
Okay, thanks, Liliana. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to share our program with you today. And as Liliana said, it's my pleasure to work daily with her team on equity, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness and sort of integrity that she brings when she's grounding that within our program. So I'm going to share quickly with you a little bit about the Link 21 program, which is a rail project in Northern California's 21 county mega region to build a new rail crossing of the San Francisco Bay. And the main goal is to integrate the different types of passenger rail that we have in the area to be more seamless and passenger facing. We have existing rail that's fairly extensive, but there's a number of challenges that make moving throughout the mega region inconvenient and unreliable, and this is often worse for our transit dependent riders. And as the fifth largest mega regional economy in the United States, our residents here suffer from a really high cost of living that results in a lack of affordable housing near their jobs. And the pandemic has really opened the door to exacerbating this program or this diversification of where people live. And so people tend to have moved further from where they need to live and work regularly. And then of course, California has really aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals, and this program has been identified in our state and regional plans to achieving those goals. So we have worked to make equity a goal of the program from its inception. Our project's been underway for about 3.5 years now. And this is because, like Karen said, historically large infrastructure projects have not really prioritized the needs of transit-dependent riders, and I agree that that's sometimes because they're hidden. And the projects have real negative impacts to historically marginalized communities. And so when we say equity, we mean that all people, regardless of their background, have the same opportunity to live happy, healthy lives. So in short, that means equity means a just and fair inclusion in society where all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We'll know we've achieved equity when someone's background or identity no longer predicts their quality of life. And for us, it means we're prioritizing equity from the beginning as we're planning our program, and we have early coordination to help shape the development of the program. So we have a multi-layered approach for integrating equity into the program. We work really hard to advance this conversation with our transit operations and transportation funding organizations and other jurisdictions and stakeholders, which I think is really important so that we all understand the different ways in which we're looking at this problem and working together to try to solve the solution or find the solution. We partner regularly with the community, and we've built relationships. It's important to go to the community and build up that trust and speak directly to the community members to understand their unique needs and opportunities. And we haven't finished this conversation. It's an ongoing conversation and will continue to be as the program advanced. And then we have what we're calling co-creation, which is critical, and we've used it since we've launched the program. And this is really where we're partnering with existing community-based organizations to really reach their membership to listen and learn on specific topics, almost like focus groups that we put together. And we actually pay these participants in order to show how much we value their time. And one thing I'm very proud of is we have an equity advisory committee that's been in place for about a year now, which provides a space for meaningful community collaboration to advance equity throughout the development of the program. So we consider those partners in our program as we're working. And that includes 20 members representing a diverse geographies and demographics. And they bring their lived experience or professional familiarity with a project to the project and help us shape the project and the scope as we're moving forward. And all of these different ways and groups have really informed how we prioritize equity within our business case framework, to define equity, like I said, to define our priority populations, and think about how it is that we are measuring equity. So within the Link 21 program, we worked really intentionally to define equity populations, which we're calling here our priority populations. And this is really in a lot of good collaboration with our STEER colleagues, so thank you. And so this is in order to measure equity as part of our program advancement and business case. So we did this by partnering with low individuals and previously historically marginalized communities. And we use that co-creation opportunity to talk about this definition and iterate on this definition. And the approach is not based solely on race or income. For our program, we've defined priority populations as census tracts in the Link 21 project area where residents experience the most burden. So I mean most economic, mobility, community, health and safety burdens. And this is largely in line with the Federal Justice 40 initiative, which Liliana was speaking about, which intends to sort of give 40% of the benefits of a program to these priority populations. So when speaking about challenges, measuring equity is a challenge because there's so many different ways you can look at it, sort of slice and dice it, and also, how we're defining it. And so one of the ways here in which we're looking at actually sort of qualitatively the benefits our program can bring is by looking at the goals and objectives and really measuring the benefits that the priority population is receiving sort of in comparison to what the general population. So here's one of our goals, transforming the passenger experience through one of our objectives to provide better service. And so some of the ways in which we're looking at this is through travel times, frequency, service hours, and you can see we're measuring those two populations to one another. But then when you actually do that, I think the challenge is that's really complex in both how you're defining population and what the goals you're trying to achieve. Is it that 40% in the Justice 40 initiative? Is it proportional to the percentage that the priority population is for the general population? Or is it a larger share of the overall benefits to really mitigate some of those past harms? So this is sort of where we are right now in the program, trying to sort of figure out how we measure it and how we sort of have that communicated forward. So next step. So learnings and moving forward, again, I said, I think it's really important to intentionally have a conversation about what people think equity means for them. As a person who really has been really privileged throughout my life, there's a lot of parts of community, there's a lot of harms and challenges communities have faced that I don't really have a perspective of from my own lived experience. And so it's really important to listen and co-create on how you're essentially measuring equity. As Liliana said, I have been really impressed because I have seen this sort of shift in the way in which we talk about the work that we've done in the past as infrastructure, I think, deliver. Like we have good goals. We haven't always achieved them, and sometimes we've made mistakes. And I think it's really, there's been an intentional sort of shift in that conversation. Again, our Equity Advisory Council is something I'm really proud of. And one of the things that I think we've learned is that compensation and transparency are key. I think it's not really rocket science, but paying these people for their time, it not only, it honors what they're bringing to the program and sort of lets them know how much they're valued and really are a part of the project team. And then moving forward, in what I'm trying to learn is in the past, BART and other agencies around here haven't really understand how to capture that value from the investments that we're providing. And often, that can be at the expense of the local communities. And so one of the things our team is working is to really understand how we can capture some of that value to sort of funnel it back to the local communities to provide for future community benefits that are both sort of a result of this program and I think also ongoing, right? So I'll stop there, hopefully spark some food for thought. Thanks, Liliana.
Definitely, Sadie, and many things that we would like to get under the hood in the Q&A session, and let's come back to some of the points that you've shared with us today. So thank you for the presentation. And then another presenter that will bring a different perspective. With Karen, we've seen kind of the learnings from research and from her work on transport poverty or social exclusion, and with Sadie about how equity is incorporating in the decision-making process of the Link 21 project. And George, through the work that we do in the Global South, we see how multilateral agencies and international cooperation have been forces to discuss, understand, and embed social issues under consideration, in particular in transport projects and mobility, that is your area of intervention. And you have been generating guidelines and included social objectives as part of the selection criteria of the project supported by the bank. So please tell us more about the details of those touch points and how they have shaped the projects where the bank is participating. So over to you, George.
Thank you, Liliana, and thanks for this invitation. And I'm glad to be here with the other panelists. So I want to first start by emphasizing what is the World Bank's mission. And actually, it's the second point listed there. It's to end extreme poverty and boost prosperity on a livable planet. So the focus on poverty and prosperity has been part of the World Bank's mission for decades, I believe. So it is one of the leading institutions really thinking about this. Obviously, more recently, other global challenges like climate change have also emerged. And I would argue also in the last decade or so, a focus on social inclusion. And I want to emphasize this by first mentioning the bank's environmental and social framework, the ESF, which supports this inclusive development, or green and resilient and inclusive development, by focusing not just on the environment and people, but also on specific areas where we think that are important for our operations to support. So this includes labor, inclusion and non-discrimination, gender aspects, climate change, biodiversity, community health and safety, and stakeholder engagement. Now, this ESF is actually a collection of World Bank policies and procedures and guidance notes. I've listed some of them here on as links at the bottom, but they're actually it's a whole set of documents developed over the years, and they apply to all of our projects, not just transport. Now, I'm going to focus a bit more on transport here, but I think it's important to note that this is a much broader framework than just infrastructure or transport. So if we focus on transport here, I'm going to use the Urban Rail Development Handbook, which was a major publication we published a few years ago, and it's available for free to download using this link, or you can just Google the title. It's although the focus is on urban rail, it actually applies quite broadly to any urban mobility type of, especially mass transit, but urban transport types of projects. And it includes 17 chapters in the whole project development cycle, from early planning, early engineering and design, project management, funding and financing, PPP, social environmental impacts as well, all the way through to thinking about the sustainability of operations and maintenance. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at it. We can move to the next slide, because I'm just going to focus on one chapter in particular. That's chapter 2, which is project planning for inclusive development. And it's one of the first chapters precisely because it's so important to think about this very early on when you're thinking about a major project or major investment in urban transport. As the other panelists have pointed out, I mean, first, because when it comes to public transport in particular and urban mobility, the poor spend a greater portion of their time and a larger share of their income commuting. I mean, this we know. This chapter, the book, has some statistics on this. We've known this for a long time. In some places, it's more severe than in others, but I think this is a stylized fact. The second stylized fact, also important here, that while improving public transport is typically pro-poor, because many of the users come from what we would call the bottom 40% by income, which we would consider poor, the projects need to be planned with social inclusion and sustainability in mind from the very beginning, right? To not aggravate certain disadvantages, let's say, with the investment. Third important fact here that we have seen in everywhere is that women and other I would say user groups, such as people with disabilities, have different mobility needs, different patterns, usually more complex travel patterns. They have less access to jobs, schools, leisure, all of the essential services that we would think about. And so these are very important. How do we translate this into actual project planning? And this is a framework, the 4 A's, which I saw Karen also mentioned here, and we detail in this chapter, what does it mean to have available services? Okay, and this the chapter also includes some indicators for this, but essentially availability talks about the connectivity and the coverage of the public transport system, and this may be affected by how the system is or isn't integrated. And by integration, I don't just mean physical integration, but is there operational integration between different modes or operators in the system? Is there tariff integration or fare system integration? The second A, accessibility, of course, I'll provide some examples here because it's very important to think about how does an individual access jobs or the other opportunities given the city's layout or land use, the availability of transport supply, and the characteristics of that individual, right? Of that potential user. Now, traditional planning approaches, which I'll describe later on, have considered very simplistic views of what is the user or potential user. And I think the literature is showing that much more can be done in this area. The third A on affordability, of course, has to do with financial and opportunity costs to travel. Again, the poor tend to spend more of their share of income on commuting, and this is a huge burden. It can be as much as 15, 20, or even higher % of the household income just to commute to work. So it's a huge burden in many places. And the fourth A on acceptability, this is quite a broad concept, but it refers to the perception or the actual quality of the user experience. So this would mean things like safety and security, or the perception of these things. Is quite important, obviously, for in particular when we're talking about women passengers. Comfort, reliability, how are these things perceived by the user? So just to conclude here with a few thoughts on the traditional planning approaches, which can certainly be improved in at least a few ways here. First, in transport modeling, we often talk about value of time for the user or the individual we're planning the system for, but it's often overlooked whose value of time. No? And often the value of time is calculated based on wages, and this has of course has a bias and implications. No? If we're basing it on what people earn, the poor, the value of time for the poor will obviously be valued less. So this has an important implications. Second point here, there's a small typo, but the total journey equals a number of steps. It's not just the actual travel time. It's the time it takes to access a bus stop or a particular facility or service, how long you wait, the actual in-vehicle travel time, and any transfers. And I think we've learned over the decades that transport models sometimes don't capture these things very well, and particularly for people that have complex travel patterns. Third point here, willingness to pay versus ability to pay. There's an important distinction here because while surveys may ask, well, what are you willing to pay? It can be quite different than someone's ability to pay. And this hasn't often been considered. Fourth point, and this is something that's emphasized in our own ESF, universal accessibility design principles. We try to incorporate this in every project. Obviously, each project has boundaries, has limitations, right? We cannot transform an entire city and make it universally accessible with a single project. We may be able to focus on one corridor or a few stations. And so it's an ongoing challenge. It's a continuous challenge to try to address this, this principle. And finally, I'll show some examples here. It's very important to try to visualize the distribution of benefits to support decision making. And by distribution of benefits, I don't just mean spatially, but by user group. But I will focus here on some maps. We can go to the next slide here to show what I mean exactly. And it's somewhat similar to some of the other presenters have shown. Quito Metro Line 1, which actually is just entered operations, commercial operations, has been in testing for quite some time, but I think just a couple of days ago began carrying passengers. Really started out more than 10 years ago, thinking about where do the people live, how will this project serve them? So this poverty map is a good example. And we can go to the next one. Quito happens to be a very linear city constrained by mountains, etc. So this project made a lot of sense because it served the main corridor of the city. But it was also important to think about how to hierarchically integrate the metro line, which becomes this backbone, with all the other modes and services operating already in Quito. And so thinking about this integration with the BRT, with the feeders, and very important here, the walking and bicycling modes, right? I have here an image on the right of the inverted pyramid, this concept that's also very emphasized in the literature, that the pedestrian and the bicyclist should have priority. And we should be thinking about how do they access these major mass transit infrastructure in particular. You know, how do people walk or bike to these places? It's often overlooked, shockingly. So I won't get into much details here, but just to say, each of the A's have indicators for accessibility. We often talk about jobs accessible by public transport within a certain time period, or isochrone. This is an example from Lima for the Line 2 Metro project. And this was some analysis done in the Chinese city of Zhengzhou, which included also the entire network that was being planned at the time, several metro lines, bus lines, changes to these lines, as well as improvements to the non-motorized transport network. And so this often requires quite a bit of data and planning and some time, but we find that it's important to ensure the return on investments, in projects. And I think there's an important case to be made that this is what improves the qualities of projects in the long run. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. And before we go to Diana, I would like to invite our attendees. I think we are receiving questions via the GoToWebinar platform, and because we're going to be with Diana for our last introductory presentation of today, is the time to ask the questions that you would like our panelists to address. And also being aware that there are questions about if the recording will be available. And yes, it will be available via YouTube. And translation, it would be possible using the platform. So last but absolutely not least, we have Diana Rodriguez, the Secretary of Women's Affairs from Bogota. And I'm very happy to have you here, Diana. 5 years ago, I led a project about diagnosing mobility patterns between women and men in Mexico City. And then we have done work in other countries like India, in the UK, and Peru. And while there are differences, mobility in relation to care is always present. And the characteristics and the kind of what drives mobility as an expression of the sexual division of labor are always present as well. Bogota has progressed, and I think this was our idea of inviting you, from diagnosing that to implementation. What does that mean? And in terms of policies and projects, you have been leading to move from this transition from diagnostics to implementation. And this is kind of the reason to have you here, because this is a webinar about embedding equity in decision making. And you're now in a moment of evaluating and assessing the impact of interventions done to move from diagnostics to decisions, including the care blocks and other transformational initiatives. So Diana, please share with us today your experience and knowledge and learnings to our audience.
Thank you, Liliana, for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you, Steer, for having me here, and a pleasure to be Sadie, Karen, and George on this panel. And so let me take you to Bogota. Let me take you, right? We went from Quito, George took us from Quito to Lima to Zhengzhou, and now let me take you to Bogota and how we embedded equity and how we thought of reorganizing a city for women around the idea of care blocks. So Bogota is a city of 8 million people, a little bit over 50%. So 52% are women, and of those women, 30%, that is 1.2 million women, dedicate their days every day to unpaid care work. That means 30% of the female population of Bogota devote their lives to washing, cleaning, cooking, taking care of children, of the elderly, of people with disabilities that require care and support. Imagine what 1.2 million women is. That's the size of the capital city of Uruguay. That's the size of Montevideo. That's the volume we're talking about. And these are just women that devote their lives to unpaid care work. I'm not even including in these 1.2 million women who have the double shift, who might have, for instance, a formal job and then devote 4 or 5 or 6 hours to unpaid work. I'm trying to focus on those in the most severe situation. And As George was saying, well, not surprisingly, these caregivers spend more time and a larger share of their income commuting. They're commuting from one center to picking up medicines, or they're isolated a lot at home. As a result, what happens? 1 out of every 5 of these women have chronic mental and health illnesses derived from the care burden. 1/3 of them reporting having absolutely no free time for themselves. 70% have not pursued education beyond high school, if any sort of education, and 90% are low income. So these women are trapped not only in economic poverty, but in time poverty. And that is what we wanted to address. We built a care system that articulates new and existing services to address the high care demands in a shared responsible manner between the city government, the national government, the private sector, communities, and households. So caregivers have time to pursue personal development, self-care, well-being, income generation, participate in politics. In short, we put together a care system so women stop putting their lives on hold to take care of others. Ultimately, our objectives are 3. The 3 R's: recognizing caregivers and their contributions, so people no longer say, what does your mother do? No, she doesn't do anything, even if she's at home doing all this care work 7 hours a day. Second, redistribute care more responsibly and equitably between men and women, and ultimately reduce that unpaid care work. And how do we do it? Who are our target populations? 3 populations. First, caregivers, mostly women, but of course there's men and non-binary persons who carry out care work, but I'm focusing on women because they perform the majority of that unpaid care work. What do we offer them? 3 groups of services: education, well-being, and income generation. What they've sacrificed because of the care burden. Second, and most importantly, at the same time, we offer professional care and playful activities for children under 13, the elderly, and persons with disabilities who require care. And lastly, men and their families, because women were not born with a DNA knowing how to care. We can all learn to care and redistribute it. So where does this happen? Where do we offer this? In care blocks. Care blocks are areas of the city around 800 meters in diameter that bring together services for caregivers, at the same time for those who require care, for care receivers, and for men and their families. All care blocks have an anchor building. That's where most of the services are offered. So, and at the same time and in the same vicinity, then there's the services for those who require care. So what are the principles of care blocks? 3 principles. First, simultaneity, and that's the core of it. The services are offered in the same vicinity for those who require care and for caregivers. Flexibility. We use existing infrastructure. Cities like Lima, Quito, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, many cities, large cities in Africa, in the developing world, they have existing infrastructure that is underutilized because governments tend to work in silos. So if it belongs to the health sector, nobody else offers services in that building. If it belongs to the women's affairs sector, nobody else offers services here. Instead, we switched and changed our method of operating from silos to integrated comprehensive government management, oriented with a mission of providing care services simultaneously. So that's flexibility. And third, proximity. Services are close to each other in order to overcome the barrier of who takes care of the people I care for, in order to be able to access services, but also proximate to where people live, to where women live. So let me take you inside a care block. That's one care block. The first care block we opened in October of 2020. It's anchored, as you can see, in one of the stations of Bogota's cable cars. So the cable cars not only reduce the time that women spend in activities related to mobility, so the so-called care mobility, so it reduces that time, but it also integrates all the services around transportation infrastructure. And there in that building, which was going to be opened and inaugurated as simply an administrative building, we built a care block. We transformed the roof so it became a space for exercise. We transformed certain classrooms so they became places where women could finish high school regardless of their age. Let me take you one step further inside that care block. That's the care block. Imagine Matilda. Matilda's a 60-year-old woman. She comes in and she can drop off her clothes at a free laundromat where her clothes are washed, dried, and folded. She has just liberated an hour and a half of her day. Then she can drop off her grandchildren or people with disabilities in playful activity like you see the one on the screen, or at a professional activity for people with disabilities that increase their autonomy. Now Matilda has just liberated at least 3 or 4 hours of her time that she can now devote to herself to pursue her goals and plans, her education, her training, her well-being, her income generation. So now Matilda can finish high school regardless of age. She can learn how to ride a bike. We want more sustainable cities. We need women knowing how to ride bikes. And women can also learn how to swim. They have free psychological and legal aid if they're victims of domestic violence. They can learn how to use a computer. They can learn multiple skills in the same vicinity while their family members are cared of. And at the same time, there's care school for men, where men learn how to change a diaper, chop food, give a bottle, and so forth. And at the same time, there's care buses, because in some areas of the city, like the rural areas of Bogota, there's no infrastructure in which we could anchor our care blocks. So we made the mobile version of care blocks. We adapted these buses inside so they became a classroom. So women jump on the bus to finish high school, to learn how to use a computer, to learn about techniques for self-care or for psychological and legal aid. And at the same time, in those inflatable tents that you see in the slide above, in the first one, those purple inflatable tents, that's where children are engaging in playful activities or people with disabilities are in some sort of exercise or training. There's also care home assistance, because some caregivers cannot leave their homes because of the condition of the people they care for. So they cannot access a care block or a care bus, and thus we take the care services and assistance services to their homes. So Bogota now has 21 care blocks in operation. We opened our first one in October of 2020, and we are inaugurating our 21st care block next week. We plan on having 45 care blocks by the end of 2035 because we included care as an organizing principle of our master urban plan. So in addition to environmental criteria, transportation criteria, we included care. And by including care, we incorporated the idea of proximity. So more proximate cities are more sustainable cities and are more equitable cities, because women, 52% of populations like Bogota, can actually access their services, and not only those of the people they care for. So in short, what care blocks do is women come out of their benches. Women are usually sitting on the benches looking at others graduate, looking at others learning how to ride a bike, looking at others enjoying playful activities. What about them? They've been trapped in that time poverty, and so care blocks bring them out of their benches so the people they care for can enjoy those activities and their development, but women can continue their life projects. We have now accessed 480,000 unique women and family members. We've liberated time through caring for their children, complementary to daycares. Also, we freed up their time equivalent to 506 days with laundromats, and close to 35,000 women have graduated from multiple areas like high school, certified in care knowledge or digital skills. Thank you very much. It's time to care and make it an organizing principle of mobility and city planning. Thank you.
Diana, thank you so much. I think by now, and such an inspiring presentation, I would personally say that, seeing kind of all those things that we see in diagnostics, as I said in the introduction to action. And by now, we have, as our attendees can see today, kind of followed a journey, right? From Karen, the research perspective and the learnings, Sadie talking about how she's embedding, and the program Link 21 is embedding equity on decision-making during the planning stages and since the beginning, as Karen was mentioning and articulating. Then George, more from a multilateral perspective, global South cities, but in any case, kind of how different criteria are used to select projects and how those criteria have been incorporated and have driven the projects where the bank is supporting and engaging in different cities. And then with Diana, what we have covered, as you have very clearly seen, is implementation, moving from that diagnostics to implementation and the learnings that we see from that. We have a few questions from the audience. Before going there, maybe I wanted to give 1 minute to see if between the panelists there is any question that you would like others to address. This is kind of a fire that we didn't plan, but I just want to see if there is any kind of reaction or kind of a question to each of the panelists, and then we will quickly move to the questions from the audience. Any reaction or question from our panelists from what you have seen from the presentations? Karen, please go ahead.
I think it's great, Diana, the way that you show that it's not just about transport. The way that you show that this is an entire exclusionary process of cities and space and proximity and all of those other things, and that you really, to have social participation and inclusion, we need to join it all up. I think we just don't do that enough with transport projects. My question being, where did the money come from? Because that can't have been cheap.
Should I answer, Liliana, or are we
yes,
taking?
Please.
Okay,
Please,
so
go
Karen,
ahead.
thank you so much, and that's the knack of it, right? All public funding. It's all, so it's taxpayers' money. It's the public budget. It was the 21 care blocks cost to operate, plus to $900,000, which is not very expensive if you think of a city of Bogota. And so it's 3.2 billion pesos, Colombian pesos. And the core of it was, yes, we did receive, of course, some grants, but it's to implement a few pilots, but that didn't go beyond $5 million US dollars. So it's mostly taxpayers' money. And the good thing of this is, there's a budget efficiency gained by using existing infrastructure, right? So instead of 4 or 5 or 6 secretaries all offering their services in a disarticulated fashion, by all going into the same place, you save money even on Wi-Fi, security, cleaning, those things that end up costing a lot for city governments. Second, it's the fact that there was a lot of existing programs out there that had just to switch their focus and be all articulated around whether recognizing caregivers, redistributing care, or reducing the time for women. So there were services, for instance, for people with disabilities. But did we ever think of offering those services at the same time as some sort of playful activities for children? No. So they were at different times, they never matched. So it was more, or a lot of fine tuning, discovering what was there, what could be used more optimally. And of course, not everything could become care, or else then we have the issue of everything, that catch-all term, and nothing is care and everything is care. So we were very strict about what care was. That's why the 3 R's are so important. But in a way, using what was there. And now, because of course the existing infrastructure starts to decrease, right? We've been using a lot. Then the question, what we've been doing is, based on the new mobility plans, for instance, Bogota's first metro line or more Transmilenio stations, is anchoring the new care blocks on those metro stations. So they're already going to build those infrastructure. It's already going to be built, but perhaps all you need is a few rooms. Of course, some have swimming pool, others don't, but it can vary, but not change the core operating logic behind it.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Karen. And I think that speaks to the heart of going from pilots, how kind of the power of pilots to then become normal planning practices, and the funding question, Karen, is a spot on, I'm sure, for many, one very much in mind. Perhaps we will have time for one more reaction between the panelists, and then we go to the questions from the audience. Any other reaction or question between this group?
I had one point for George, which I'm thinking that it's more of a less a question or a question and a thought, which is, George, have you, because as I mentioned, I completely agree that you're spot on when you talk about the poor spending more time and a larger share, and that women have different, and certain populations have different mobility patterns and less access to jobs and to schools and everything you pointed to, which is at the core of what we're doing. Have you focused on caregivers specifically, or is that still an avenue to explore with the World Bank?
Yes, thank you, Diana. I've actually learned quite a lot from your presentation. I mean, we've had some interaction with academics focused on care work and the mobility of care and the importance of that. I think there's more that we can do to consider this in our projects. As you well know, I mean, the World Bank is among the co-financiers, also working in Bogota on the metro, and I think learning from the pilots is quite important. I find it very interesting the concept that you presented and the experiences you've already had. I've worked also in Brazil, where there was an attempt years ago also to try to provide childcare facilities at certain stations. And I think that some of the early experiences, actually, we learned that, well, we need to consider also whether these are the most desirable places for these services. No? Sometimes transport stations or terminals are not the best places or most inviting places. No, so if I guess hopefully I'm responding to your question that I think we need. There's a lot that we need to learn, and I'm also wondering if I could ask you a question. I mean, how have you been able to select these locations to ensure that they're not well, that they're perceived as safe, secure, and the right location, to have these services?
Thank you, George. And I'll let Diana respond to that question, and then we have questions from the audience to Sadie and Karen. So, Diana.
Thank you, George. So 2 clarifications. The first one is we're picking not only mobility, like say transportation hubs or transportation stations. This one is one of them. Some of the other care anchor buildings have been, for instance, health centers that were very big and some parts underutilized, community development centers, which are the ideal anchor building, administrative buildings like the one I pointed out to, which happened to be the administrative building next to the transportation hub. But we did construct a prioritization index, which is it's a index with 4 variables that take into consideration the care demand, the caregiver's density, the poverty levels, and also the participatory budgeting decisions of each district. So Bogota is divided into 20 districts, and we ran this this prioritization index. And what that did was it ranked the districts from those requiring the care blocks more urgently and those with the less pressure for care needs. That was our initial way of deciding in which districts we were going to start. And then we also mapped all of the existing public care infrastructure. With the help of ECLAC, of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, we in a website where you can click what's available. So what we did was, let's start seeing where that overlaps. What's available? Where's the deficit? Where can we start grounding them? And also, because care blocks are not just one building, but the anchor building connected to a few other buildings, say a school and or a public park, in which we could provide those services. But then we expanded in our master urban plan. We went from that prioritization index with the 4 variables, each one weighing 25%, to including the new mega mobility projects, right? The modal integration areas, including areas of urban development prioritized by the master urban plan, and facilities deficit. So also a way of where there is care infrastructure or some sort of infrastructure, let's use it there. But where there's a lack of it, let's take advantage of building care blocks and planning them there as a way to closing the gap related to care infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Diana, for responding George's question. And I'm sure, or I think this reflects kind of the learning that this session is for all of us, for the panelists included. So we have a question from the audience to Sadie. Sadie, you have in your presentation included how the Link21 project is doing the comparison of benefits using the priority populations definition. Does the general population include your priority population, or is it everyone else? And for example, are you comparing to the overall average or to the non-priority population?
Thanks, Liliana. Well, I think this actually gets to the heart of some of the challenges of it. Liliana and Emily, who are on the call, probably know better than I do the way in which we're doing this. But I think that it's one of the things that we've tried to talk to our Equity Advisory Council and our co-creation, our partners about, because really it is, I think, as I mentioned, thinking about, are you trying to mitigate past harms? Are you trying to just provide equal distribution of benefits? And so I think in general, right now, we're comparing just the priority population to the general population, which includes the priority population as well. But once you get all of this data, you realize that there's so many different ways to parse it. And we all want to do make the right decisions, and it is really complicated, and I guess I'll just leave it at that. So, but if you do want to know more, you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with the right people to get into the numbers with.
Thank you so much, Sadie. And now we have a question from the audience for Karen. Karen, and I think this also reflects, we had more than 300 people kind of registered for this webinar, and the international footprint, we had people from more than 10 countries joining us today. So Karen, the question for you is, if you could create a government grant program that funded one type of project around the UK to address the issues that you have highlighted, what would it be?
Oh my goodness, that's an easy question, isn't it? I think the point is that there isn't one program. It just depends where you are, and that's the whole point, is that it depends the physical locations, the type of populations you want to affect, what types of inclusion. I mean, I think it's great what they're doing in Bogota, because they focused on that particular issue around women, and therefore they're very able to then see needs. I would say with what Sadie's doing, you know, it's really important not to just think about the quantitative data and whether you're doing it with the averages and this and that, but actually what you said was, you know, finding out what people's own perceptions of equity and fairness and what they can and can't do, and it's coming from the grassroots. I think the stuff that George was talking about, you know, you can do all of these evaluations, you could do very tricksy things, but you can still end up with projects that are actually disadvantaging people. So particularly with big infrastructure projects, we get the project right. We have glorious disabled universal access for the project, but you can't actually get to the station because the surrounding area. So thinking more about whole treatment. So I think that's just an impossible question for me to ask. But what I think is it has to be integrated. It has to be we have to think about multiple modes. We definitely have to think about the walking, because a lot of people are doing a lot of walking. The 4 A's are really important. You know, it is acceptability as well. All those issues around safety and those other things. So for me, it's just like the message, as I said, was like, we actually have to assess everything from an equity perspective, has to be embedded. And there's no such thing as a project that doesn't affect equity. They all do. And assuming that there's somehow business as usual and you can build something and then you can do something else on the back. I think, Sadie, you said avoid was the most important thing, because it's so hard to retrofit. So once you've done the disaster and nobody can get access, or you're only doing commuting trips and you're not thinking about the fact that more than 50% of trips are non-commuting trips, right? And the time of the day is different. It's all in the detail. And so, you know, sort of the point being, you have to embed equity from the beginning. Thank you, Liliana. You know, it has to be there, spoken loud from the very beginning, and it has to have that intention behind it with a political will. So, like, for example, Transport for the North majoring on the fact that they're going to deal with transport related social exclusion through everything that they do, their whole strategy. Not, you know, that's on an equal footing to things like the economy and the environment and all of those things. And, you know, that's, you've got to give it room and space.
Thank
So
you
not
so
a very
much.
good answer, I'm afraid, but the best I can do.
Thank you so much, Karen. I have from the participants other punctual questions, but I have received one that is more to all the panelists, and perhaps maybe two can we can allow to address this question. So, talking about equity and decision making, how do transportation planners or transportation decision makers navigate the perpetual trade-off between expanding service coverage, increasing services in the pursuit of equity? Which aspect do you believe should take precedence, and why?
Well, I can take a cut at it. I think it's a difficult question, and actually one that I would raise as well. There are always trade-offs, no? I think I would say that this is why it's important to have stakeholder engagement and think about broadly about stakeholders. Who are the real stakeholders? Because there naturally needs to be a process to weigh the priorities, and out of that process, sort of a multi-criteria process would come out. I think some of the answers to what is most important with the available budget or available time in that particular moment. You know, and this is why I was very interested by Diana's response about the prioritization process undertaken in Bogota. I think the result might be different in each place, and it has to do with who are the stakeholders, who has input to identify and weigh these different criteria. And so I think it's very difficult to say ex ante, you know, what are the trade-offs that need to be made, but very important to identify these stakeholders from the very beginning.
Thank you so much, George. And we have another question that would be for the participants or the speakers to discuss. How do we balance the dual challenges of decarbonization and inclusion? For example, over higher income groups may have higher emissions. Some may be prioritized for the interventions like electrical vehicles charging. but that doesn't necessarily have the equity benefits that we might be looking for. So any reactions from the panelists about this very, in the middle of COP28, very relevant and timely question. Diana, please go ahead.
So in a way, and let me take you back to care blocks just for concrete examples, not just to talk about this, but one of the things that is like a secondary impact of care blocks is by putting all services together and reducing the time women and caregivers spend on public transportation, you are using a social innovation to address the climate crisis. And in a way with this prompt, and also we know, so that's one way. It's like when you plan cities that are more proximate and when you articulate services for the different types of services that people need, and care being one of those most highly demanded in cities, when you put them together, then people can access care blocks mostly, or any other service, mostly by foot, and so, or by bike. And so that automatically starts changing and transforming patterns that are going to contribute to lowering emissions. But it's also, and also in a secondary level, we know that this might not be a mitigation strategy, but it is an adaptation strategy, is enhancing the abilities of women. We know that poverty makes the consequences of climate change more severe, and especially on women. So when you are investing on strengthening women's capacities, for example, finishing high school regardless of age, and we've had 850 women graduate from high school between December and July, right? You are enhancing their resilience. And so you're enhancing strategies to better adapt to climate change. So it's switching the lens and thinking what else beyond, of course, electric buses are important, and Bogota feels proud of them as well, and George knows that very well, and having a public operator all run on electric buses and by women is also one of those solutions we put forward. But what I'm trying to put out there is, let's think of barriers beyond transportation and emissions that also contribute to the climate crisis and that we can also do in tandem.
Thank you so much, Diana. And
Can I just add to that? I think the point is that actually many low-income populations across the world, disadvantaged, are hugely reliant on slow modes, non-polluting modes, walking, right? And so actually what you want to do is lock that behavior in, and driving up mobility is the problem. So the more we drive up mobility, the more we think that we need people to move. I'm not saying they need to be immobile, but the more that we require people to move, to be included, to participate, the bigger the problem is. So what we need to do is lock in the sort of good behaviors that are already happening without the consequences of social exclusion. And I think if you start with social exclusion, what can people do? How are they able to participate to ensure that that happens? And then you think about the lowest mobility options that you can possibly have, because the keto example, it's like, it's great, but actually what's happening in keto is people are getting driven further and further and further and further out into the periphery. The lower income populations get driven out as mobility becomes the only way, right? So, and then you have locked in the UK, very low income car dependent households living in places where public transport isn't, because they shouldn't have been pushed that far out in the first place. So it's that whole thing of proximity and connectivity, but it isn't an easy trade-off. And I just basically think government shouldn't be spending a huge amount of money funding rich people to electrify and do all that when they can afford it themselves. You charge them to do it, they do it because they have to, and you support people from social exclusion.
Yeah, just to chime in on that, my answer to the original question is it's about the structure in which we finance and fund transit infrastructure and investment, right? In the Bay Area, our ridership recovery post-COVID hasn't really it hasn't come back as quickly as maybe some other areas, and we are very dependent on the customer or the fare box recovery. And I think it just points out sort of the critical default that we have in the way in which we're funding our infrastructure or our transportation, right? Because the impact then results in less service and it hurts the people that need it the most. So I think it's, and I mean, there's all different structures of governance on the call right here, but intentionally, I think it's looking at all of those together and really being intentional in where you can get the value for reducing the VMTs and the greenhouse gas reduction, and making intentional decisions, as Karen was saying, to advance the projects that are more equitable, right? I mean, I think it's okay to have the burdens of financing it fall differently based on people's means. So
Thank you so much. It was a question of the trade-offs. Please,
sorry,
George,
Liliana,
go, and then I have a question for Sadie. Yeah.
Sure. Just picking up on the point that Karen made about, I'm also, concerned for equity reasons, how EV investments, public investments in electric vehicle infrastructure happens, because it can be, particularly in the developing world or where resources are scarce. It's important to really focus on, and this is our advice, and actually the World Bank has published a report on the economics of electric mobility, where one of the recommendations is clearly for the vast majority of developing countries, where we should put public resources first is in electrifying buses, and in some places two-wheelers and three-wheelers that provide these services. So rather than charging infrastructure for people with private electric vehicles. So hopefully that is clear. The report, I mean, there's a lot to be explored here on this issue of decarbonizing and equity. But I very much agree, with Deanna's points as well, and all the other panelists talking about. I mean, we have to find the win-wins, no? With all these challenges, we have to find a way to integrate all of these things and focus on the return on the investment, the opportunities that provide the best returns.
Thank you, George. And I think we have time for 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up the session. But first, it's a question to Sadie, whether you could expand briefly. You talked about governance as part of Link 21 and kind of the Equity Accountability Council that was generated for the program. If you could expand on the role and a few kind of highlights of that council and how it's fitting into the decisions of Link 21.
Sure. Well, so we consider the Equity Advisory Committee to be sort of part of our project team. So we try to take things to them while we're developing them and working on them, so that we can have feedback that we incorporate into the work that we've done. But I would say that a lot of the things that have sort of bubbled up as some of their major issues are fares, not only affordability, but accessibility. And so that's something that they really elevated in the way in which we're looking at things, which sort of gets back to my previous comment about sort of like just overall how we fund transportation infrastructure and its availability. And then there is a big passion to discuss, community stabilization. We're not really expanding, we're sort of infilling in our area, but that means that there's the potential for infrastructure to be put in places where it's already sort of had negative impacts as a result of infrastructure. So I think thinking about how to prevent anti-displacement, how we spent a lot of time thinking about, how you can model areas that are vulnerable or communities that are vulnerable to displacement. And so I think that's one of the things we are going to continue to work on, which, relates to things that other members have said, of just talking with the local communities, understanding what community benefits that they want. And I thought what Diana said was really, she mentioned, participatory budgeting and those types of things. So I think that's a lot of hard work that has to happen, and we're trying to do it, as we develop the program. So I think that from the EAC, those are two things that have risen to the top, and it's very consistent with, I think, people who are using a system and want to be able to access a system and want to make sure that it meets their needs. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Sadie. And finally, there are more questions, and let's see. But there is a question about any specific issues that the panelists have found around equity for First Nations or Indigenous communities, and how to engage with them specifically and their needs. Any perspective on that group?
So I haven't done anything for a while. And obviously, we're not talking about First Nations in the same way in the UK context. But previously, when I was working in Australia, and we were very much thinking about Indigenous populations there, who were quite often on the very isolated and really impoverished, and have a completely different sort of system of mobilities as well, of what they want and where they want to go, and what's where the priority areas are. And all I can say is that you have to take a participatory approach. You have to work with those communities, you have to bring them into the conversation, and you have to plan, and you have to not. It was quite interesting when I was there, because one of the things that came out was that actually transport ended up being one of the first entry points for young people, young men particularly, into the criminal justice system. Because in fact, what was happening, that they were so isolated, they were driving vehicles that were illegal, all sorts of issues around, and then they were getting caught. They were driving at night and drinking and then getting caught, and that was the first point of entry for the criminal justice system. So I think there isn't a particular, I would never want to generalize about this. I think that's the whole point, is that you can't provide this flat approach to anything. We can do all the mapping we like, but at the end of the day, you have to have the voices in the room. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Karen. And Diana, there is a question for you, and perhaps I can give you 30 seconds before we close. It is about data of engagement or uptake from the community since introducing the scheme, and if not, any challenges or barriers that you foresee in addressing this. But it would have to be a very short answer.
So actually, I'm going to dovetail on Karen's response to answer this response, which is, and Sadie's, which is, it takes time, and it takes time to incorporate the voices, and it should not be just seen as a hurdle and something that, oh, we have to tick the box because we need to guarantee participation. It impacts the design, the use, the usefulness, both whether it's a transportation and mobility solution, whether it's a care block, whatever it is. So just give me so in our case, we had multiple focus groups with Afro-descendants, migrant population, rural communities, both to understand and corroborate their need of where it should be, but also the types of services provided, right? And to really understand, for instance, there's one area of the city in which the care blocks do not offer individual psychological sessions, but they all offer group sessions. Why? Because the migrant population coming mostly from Venezuela said, we don't want individual sessions, we want group sessions to build our ties again. And so we switched our service there. The same thing, Afro-descendants, or the times in which certain services are offered. It's not the same thing offering services to women engaged in prostitution because they cannot access services at 7 p.m. They need to access them at 2 p.m. So that requires time to really understand that it's not a hurdle, it's an indispensable, necessary variable for success.
Thank you so much, Diana.
For intended.
We could be here longer, I know, and there are other questions that we didn't manage to get to, and hopefully these are for a next conversation of this kind. Thank you so much to all of you, our panelists. It has been a great conversation, food for thought, definitely. And I hope it has been informing and useful for you too. We are going to be sharing a summary of this session, what we have learned. And as I said at the beginning and during the presentation, the recording would be available via YouTube. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for all our attendees and their time. And I wish you a very good rest of the week and rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liliana.
Thank you.
A real pleasure to be with all four of you. Thank you so much. And
Great.
thank everyone for
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.